The NHL trade deadline day is fast approaching, which means that our timelines and feeds are about to be inundated with rumors and hot takes. Every single trade will be scrutinized, broken down, and dissected 3 ways till Sunday, with every commentator and jackass with a microphone trying to figure out which teams won or lost said trade. And so before the madness all really comes to a head, I decided to sit down and take a look at the last 10 years of trade deadlines to try and figure out the answer to one pretty simple but also very difficult to answer question. What is a first round pick worth? Because the prospect of teams trading their first round pick seems appealing, but trying to evaluate how valuable that pick is really can only be done truthfully in hindsight. When the pick has been made, the player developed, so the consequences of the trade won't be felt until a few years down the road. And I'm sure a lot of people analyzing trades will therefore kick the can down the road a bit, saying, well, we can only find out who won and lost this trade until the team who is adding at the deadline goes on their deep playoff run, and a few years later when the team who is selling is developing those picks and players. But I want to challenge that sentiment, because every year NHL teams trade picks, prospects, and players to each other at the trade deadline, and those players that they're exchanging have value. As most of you who are regulars know, I am a big fan of Hockey Reference's point shares, as they can provide a sort of holistic overview of a player's value to their team in a given season. So what I did was I went back for the last 10 years and looked at the month prior to the trade deadline, all of the deals that were made, and try to figure out what point value I could ascribe to certain picks and prospects, to at least try to understand how NHL GMs tend to value these assets. And some of the results were kind of shocking. But before I get into the 6 big surprising principles that came out when breaking down the last 10 years of trade deadlines, let's answer the question that I posed at the very beginning of the video: what is a first round pick worth in terms of point share? And the answer is quite a fair bit. A first-round pick in that year's NHL entry draft is worth, on average, about 3 points share at the time of the deadline. So for instance, Sean Monahan, at the time he was traded from the Canadiens to the Winnipeg Jets, had a 3.0 point share value. So Winnipeg theoretically should have only traded him for a first-round pick, but that only scratches the surface when we look at how GMs have valued their other picks and prospects over the last 10 years. So the first surprising principle that I came across in my analysis is that prospects are actually more valuable than picks. When looking at the prospects who were dealt, I classified them into both elite and quality prospects, elite prospects being ones who were picked in the first round in the last 3 years, or who were listed in the top 100 prospects in the NHL in the year that they were traded. And those elite high-end prospects actually tended to be traded for about half a point extra value compared to a first-round pick in the upcoming NHL entry draft. Now this kind of makes sense because when you're trading for a prospect as opposed to a pick, you know what you're getting, you can scout the player. A selling team might be acquiring a prospect that they were interested in drafting, but maybe didn't get to them, or that they passed up on because they saw another prospect that they really liked, whereas just taking on a draft pick might be seen as a little bit more of a risky proposition because you don't know where you'll be picking, and you don't know who might be available for you to pick there. And so as a result out there, if you're a contending team with a loaded, deep prospect pool, you have an advantage because you have more valuable assets in your arsenal that you can trade as opposed to a team that's still contending and might have their draft picks, but they don't have any high-end prospects that they can use to maybe push their value a little bit higher. The second big principle I saw is that a lot of teams are swapping third-round picks in one-for-one deals with players. These usually tend to be lower-end depth players like third and fourth liners, third-pairing defensemen. So don't be shocked and outraged if you see a guy like Nick Aube-Kubel go for a third-round pick at the deadline. That's kind of the asking price for players of that caliber. Principle number 3 that popped up is that retaining salary doesn't really affect the value of a trade that heavily. It can swing it by 0.1 or 0.2 point share, but for the most part, teams that are retaining salary in a trade are just doing so that the other team has the ability to make their new roster fit onto the salary cap. Usually it doesn't come with any major additional assets. Maybe they'll throw in like a 6th-round pick or a swap of mid-round picks, but if your team is selling and they're retaining salary on trade deadline day, it's not some shrewd move by your GM, it's really just kind of the cost of doing business. The next principle that jumped out to me makes a lot of intuitive sense, which is just that draft values lose a ton of value the further in the future they are. So for example, a draft pick in the 2025 NHL entry draft is worth about half of a first-round pick in the 2024 entry draft. Again, following the same sort of principle as trading for a prospect, first-round pick in this year's draft is a little bit more stable. You know who the players are a lot better. You've been scouting them for longer. But also having a pick in a draft that's a few years away kind of doesn't do you any good if you're a GM whose team is losing. because you might not be there to use it. The more you can acquire assets that you can use soon in the future, the better. The next surprising principle I discovered is that you don't tend to get a big discount for being early. By which I mean, if you're a team that takes a player off the board in a position of need, well ahead of the trade deadline, you get the first defenseman or center off of the board, you actually don't end up saving a whole ton of draft value. Now, in economics terms, this makes no sense because as the supply of players available at the deadline dwindles, the prices go up. So you would think that it would be in the team's best interest to try and get trades done early ahead of the deadline, maybe in the month or a few weeks out. However, I think it might just be as simple as the fact that sellers are not incentivized to make these deals early. They want to hold on to these players as long as they can and drive up the price as high as they can. So teams who are trading away players early on, well ahead of the deadline, probably know that they are hitting their max value when it comes to these trades. And also, when you're well ahead of the trade deadline, you have the risk that the team that you're dealing with finds another trade partner and no longer needs you. You definitely don't want to be the team that's holding on to a player you're trying to unload an hour before the deadline. There just might not be enough demand or trading partners to go with, and your player's value could plummet. And the final and biggest principle that I found when looking at 10 years worth of trade deadline data is that the biggest intangible characteristic that will swing a player's value in a trade is age. There is a 1 point difference between trading a player who is under 25 versus one who is over 35, even if they have the exact same level of productivity. It doesn't matter if you're retaining salary, if those players are on expiring contracts, or if they're locked up long term. When young players are available at the deadline, their value is massive compared to a similar profile player who's in his prime or over the hill. So having said all of that, let's put these principles into practice and try and create a potential fair value trade for Noah Hanifin, who is the #1 target on most people's trade deadline lists. Well, as of right now, Noah Hanifin has a 5.4 point share in 51 games with the Calgary Flames. So if he maintains that same level of productivity, the Flames are looking at a package coming back to them similar to the one that Timo Meier fetched for the Devils last year. Hanifin will absolutely fetch at least a first-round pick or a high-end prospect, but even if a team offered first-round picks this year and next year, that wouldn't match the value that Hanifin has on the trade deadline. You would have to throw in a sweetener, maybe like a 4th or a 5th rounder, to make the value work.